Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Gregory Scarpa, a man whose name became known in both loyalty and mystery within New York's underworld. Known for his confidence, charm, and sharp instincts, Scarpa moved through the world of organized power with precision and influence. To some, he was a devoted figure of strength and authority. To others, a man whose story reveals the complex balance between loyalty and survival. Gregory Scarpa was born in Brooklyn in 1928, carved by the tail end of the Depression and the hard-edged lessons of stoops and storefronts. The neighborhoods where he came of age carried their own rules. Men talked in low voices and measured every word. A young ear learned what to repeat and what to bury. There were family tables, Sunday meals, and the tight social web of an Italian-American enclave where favors kept everything moving. Around the corners and under the awnings, small rackets thrived. Policy slips, numbers, games, loans made on a handshake, and repaid on time because delay brought a knock no one wanted. In this world, he found a path and did not look back. By the 1,950 seconds, old alliances in the Profaci organization, the future Colombo family, shaped his rise. Reliable earners who kept problems away from the bosses advanced. He understood how to keep clients in line without spectacle. He studied men who let fear do the work of fists, and he imitated them until that style fit him like a tailored suit. Extortion rackets, loan collections, illegal gambling, and hijacked loads were the school where he earned trust. He became known as a determined collector, never sloppy, never seen lingering, always 2 steps ahead. When the money came in on time, no one asked questions. When it didn't, he found the right door and made sure the problem did not repeat. Power inside a crime, family favors those who bring steady profit and enforce discipline. His crew formed around him in Brooklyn and Staten Island. Collectors who visited bars, bookmakers with telephones humming, drivers who parked across the street and pretended to read a paper. Physically imposing displays made headlines. He avoided that. Quiet pressure worked better. A man's job, his reputation, his peace of mind. The law called these acts extortion and racketeering. On those blocks, people called them the cost of staying open. Over time, he was more than a soldier. He had his own earners, his own say, his own table at restaurants where he never waited for a menu. In the early 1,960 seconds, the family was racked by the Gallo-Profaci feud and later reorganized under the Colombo name. When crews argued, he kept his footing by aligning with leaders who valued results. Violence was a given in those years. Authorities linked him to enforcement missions that never made the papers at the time but surfaced later in court filings and sworn statements. This was the era when his reputation hardened. He cultivated an aura, controlled, unflinching, unsentimental. Newspapers much later would call him the Grim Reaper. The label stuck because it fit the impression he left, a man who arrived without bluster and made outcomes permanent. Then came a twist almost no one from the street could have predicted. In 1963, he began working as a confidential informant for the FBI. Different sources describe different triggers. Legal pressure, a desire for money, a calculation that information could buy protection. Whatever the exact spark, he started giving agents insight into the inner life of the Colombo family and the broader underworld. He received cash payments. He met handlers who logged his tips. It did not end his life in organized crime. It layered it. While he fed the government bits it could use, he kept building his own rackets. It was a double existence that would stretch, with stops and starts, for decades. National tumult set the stage for one of the most controversial chapters linked to his name. During the 1964 search in Mississippi for 3 murdered civil rights workers, multiple books and journalists later reported that he traveled south at the quiet request of federal officials and coerced a Ku Klux Klan member into revealing where the bodies were buried. The FBI has never formally endorsed that account, and some historians question details, but the story has circulated widely for years. Whether he beat the answer out of anyone, or only confirmed information through contacts, his name became tied to an episode in which federal investigators were under immense pressure, and an underworld source allegedly delivered what they couldn't obtain by ordinary means. The civil rights martyrs were found. For him, the notoriety of that episode became part of the aura, a gangster who, by some accounts, had once helped the government solve a case that transfixed the nation. Back in New York, he resumed the routines that made him valuable. He collected cash from numbers bankers. He kept loan customers current. He protected business owners who paid for his crew's security. He brokered access to union influence, a lever that could slow or speed deliveries, open or close job sites. He arbitrated disputes inside the family. He oversaw gambling dens where phones rang through the night, especially on big game days. Prosecutors later assembled charges that described a tapestry of crimes: extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, transport of stolen goods, and acts of lethal enforcement. The legal language is dry. The lived reality is not. Small business owners worried, gamblers hid, debtors looked over their shoulders, and sometimes people disappeared. He kept doing what he did best, maintaining order through fear and making sure money flowed upward. He managed a complicated personal life as well. He had a household and, for years, a companion named Linda Shiro, who later went before grand juries, authors, and reporters to describe what she said she had witnessed and heard. She claimed he had confessed to dozens of killings and explained his dealings with an FBI handler. Some of her later testimony in a high-profile case was discredited by a judge for inconsistency, and charges against the agent she accused were dismissed, yet her accounts still influenced how the public came to understand him. That duality runs through every part of his story. Official records sit beside contested recollections, and sometimes the line between fact and rumor is thin. What is not disputed is that he treated fear as an instrument and leveraged both his crew and his relationship with law enforcement to keep himself in play. In the 1,970 seconds, he became a capo, a captain with a crew that answered to him. With that rank came more responsibility and greater exposure. He oversaw schemes in Brooklyn and beyond. Protection payments from bars and social clubs, casino-style games in back rooms, skims from construction and trucking, a network of Shylock loans with rates that guaranteed the principal never truly died. He enforced discipline wordlessly. When he walked into a room, men sat straighter. He negotiated with other families when boundaries blurred and stepped back when a conflict threatened to heat up more than it was worth. He was not reckless. He measured risk. Those who opposed him learned that argument carried a cost. When prosecutors later tallied up murders and murder conspiracies, his name appeared repeatedly, sometimes as a direct participant, sometimes as the man who ordered the act. The filings are dry, the effect severe. During this decade, his connection with the FBI deepened. Handlers changed over time, and one name eventually loomed large: R. Lindley DeVecchio, an agent who became his primary point of contact. Critics and journalists later claimed the relationship crossed the line from informant handler to something far more entangled, with allegations that the agent supplied him with sensitive information that he used to target rivals. DeVecchio denied criminal wrongdoing, retired from the bureau, and was later prosecuted in state court. The case fell apart when a key witness's credibility collapsed, and the judge dismissed the charges. That legal outcome did not erase the cloud over the bureau's decades-long reliance on a murderous informant. To this day, books and investigative pieces use their relationship as a cautionary tale about the perils of cutting deals with violent criminals in the name of intelligence. The 1,980 seconds brought both continuity and crisis. He kept running rackets. He kept feeding the FBI when it suited him. He tried to maintain a low public profile, even as his private ruthlessness intensified. Then illness struck. In the mid-1,980 seconds, he underwent surgery, and according to contemporaneous reports and later court filings, contracted HIV from a blood transfusion. Treatments were primitive then. The diagnosis would have rattled any man. He carried it like another secret. He didn't show frailty in public. He still appeared at his usual haunts, still gave instructions to his crew, still treated debt collection and bookmaker protection as routine business. People who encountered him came away with the same impression. Even when thinning, he projected certainty. Inside the family, storms gathered. Boss Carmine Persico went to prison in the 1,980 seconds but maintained control from behind bars. A rival faction, aligned with acting boss Victor Orena, began pressing for power. Lines hardened. Whispers turned into threats. Crews picked sides. In that tinderbox, his skills as an enforcer and strategist made him central. He was a Persico loyalist. His trusted lieutenants drove the streets with eyes scanning mirrors. Men started wearing bullet-resistant vests under shirts. Bars that had once hosted friendly drinks now felt like traps. Each phone call could carry news of an ambush. New York had seen internecine mob wars before, but as the 1,990 seconds dawned, this one promised to be brutal even by those standards. Through it all, he kept up the balancing act that defined his life. He still had contacts at the bureau. He still collected protection money. He still projected calm. He had raised a son in the life, Gregory Jr., who would later make headlines of his own as a federal informant behind bars. His home life and his work bled into each other. People called at all hours. He took steps to guard what he had built, moving between safe apartments, employing drivers he trusted, keeping conversations short, and rarely trusting that any room was free of listeners. He had lived with danger for decades. He thought he understood its grammar. What he could not control was how age, illness, and a family war would intersect. The Colombo conflict took street corners and spread to living rooms. Meals were interrupted by warnings. Old friends became suspects. Every loyalty demanded proof. In that setting, his name surfaced repeatedly in federal wiretaps and grand jury rooms. Agents mapped his movements. Prosecutors sharpened charges. He had always told himself he could walk between raindrops, give enough information to stay useful, use that access to shield himself and strike enemies, and keep earning in the meantime. The clouds, however, were converging. A lifetime of extortion, loan collections, illegal gambling operations, and directed killings had left a paper trail in subpoenaed ledgers and a human trail in witnesses who wanted out. Even his FBI relationship, once a shield, was turning into evidence that would haunt both sides. The portrait at this point in his life is of a man who embodied contradiction, not in theory but in daily practice. He was gentle with children who visited the family table, and ruthless with debtors who made the mistake of thinking deadlines were flexible. He brushed off formal education and became a master of human calculus. He cultivated law enforcement while undermining it. The crimes tied to his name are not mysteries. Extortion backed by fear, illegal gambling enterprises, loan sharking schemes that trapped borrowers, hijackings, and a long list of killings and murder conspiracies laid out in indictments and plea papers. He turned pressure into currency. He made information work both ways. The nation would soon see just how far those habits could carry him into the chaos of a mob civil war and straight into the center of federal cases that finally forced him to stand in open court and admit to acts he had spent a lifetime denying. He had built a life on boundaries other people couldn't see. He believed he could always sort friends from foes, always know which way the wind was blowing, always make a deal that kept him on top. But a man who spends decades threading needles eventually pricks his fingers. The same caution that preserved him for so long began to look like paranoia. The same connections that once felt like armor began to feel like chains. In New York's most combustible crime family, during one of its most volatile chapters, Gregory Scarpa had run out of room to maneuver. By the time the city's skyline flashed with new towers and old bridges felt like the only things that didn't change, he had settled into a rhythm that looked effortless from the outside and required constant calculation behind the scenes. He rose before the streets fully woke, checked on bookmakers who ran phone lines out of back rooms, spoke softly with men who handled cash drops, and kept a mental map of which debtors were falling behind and which ones just needed a nudge to stay current. The law called it racketeering. On his blocks, it was business management with consequences. He didn't wave pistols or shout in lobbies. He preferred quiet meetings in parked cars and short walks on gray sidewalks where people knew when to keep conversations private. The fewer people who understood what he expected, the safer he felt. That instinct had preserved him through changing bosses and revised loyalties, and it set the stage for what came next. His status inside the Colombo family rose through the 1,970 seconds into the 1,980 seconds, because his crew delivered steady earnings and fewer headaches than most. The work covered familiar ground: loans at hard terms, protection payments from bars and clubs that wanted problems to stay far away, card games that never closed, and a slice of whatever passed through certain warehouses. Investigators later described hijacked loads and stolen goods moving through networks that rarely left paperwork. He handled disputes like a neighborhood judge, deciding who owed what, when a favor counted as payment, and when someone had to learn that promises carried a clock. He projected calm and expected others to mirror it. The more he avoided spectacle, the more powerful he seemed. At the same time, he kept his unusual link to federal agents alive. He had begun supplying information in the early 1960 seconds, and the relationship evolved over decades. The Bureau gave him money for tips and treated him as a prized source on the inner workings of one of New York's major crime families. Different handlers came and went. One agent, R. Lindley DeVecchio, would later loom large in accounts of those years. The exchange of information and favors created a protected space where he believed he could operate with fewer risks, and it created a problem that never disappeared. Every meeting with the government left a trace, and every favor he received would one day be examined by prosecutors, reporters, and judges who wanted to know how far that cooperation had gone. Even while keeping up his side of the bargain for his crew, he fed the government exactly what he thought would keep him valuable without shutting down his own rackets. That balancing act held, then wobbled. Midway through the 1980 seconds, health blindsided him. After surgery, he received a transfusion, later reported to have transmitted HIV at a time when testing and treatment were rudimentary. He didn't announce it, didn't ask for sympathy, and didn't slow down more than circumstances forced. He still chose the table in the corner, still gave instructions in brief phrases, still held morning check-ins with collectors who counted cash with practiced fingers. People noticed he thinned out, that long hours took a toll, but the voice stayed level and the stare never softened. Whatever fear the diagnosis put into him, he folded it into the daily routines that had become his armor. The mob world around him grew turbulent. Long prison terms landed on senior bosses in multiple families, reshaping lines of authority. In the Colombos, Carmine Persico retained control from behind bars, and a rival faction around Victor Arena pushed for a different future. Old friendships strained under the pressure. A quiet lunch could turn into a debate about who gave orders and who deserved a seat at the table. The split deepened until the city braced for a war that would seep into parking lots, stairwells, and curbside ambushes. He chose his side without hesitation. Persico had backed him, and he would return the loyalty with results. Daily life altered. He rotated safe apartments, swapped cars often, and kept meetings short. Drivers were instructed to loop around blocks, check mirrors, and never get comfortable. Telephones went from useful tools to potential traps. Conversation trimmed down to essentials. On certain days, he wore a vest under his shirt. He was older now, managing illness and conflict at once, but he made up for reduced stamina with planning. People who had once joked freely around him grew serious. They could feel that the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. The war touched families. People canceled gatherings, avoided their usual haunts, and listened for names on nightly news. He stayed out of public view as much as possible, and drove strategy from rooms where only a handful of loyalists were allowed. Prosecutors later tied him to planning and carrying out violent missions during that period, framing the war as a series of calculated moves rather than chaotic street scuffles. They said he tracked rivals, used information from contacts in and around law enforcement, and picked the moments when pressure would hurt most. Supporters of the other faction accused him of crossing every line. His camp said he did what internal rules had always demanded when someone challenged rightful leadership. However anyone phrased it, the effect on the city was unmistakable. A family conflict became a public ordeal, with commuters reading headlines and residents adjusting routes to avoid blocks rumored to be hot. Through it all, he kept earning from loans, protection fees, and gambling operations, because cash flow kept crews loyal, and loyalty kept him relevant. The FBI relationship that had protected him for years now created risk from a different angle. Journalists began to hear that a longtime source inside the Colombos had escaped consequences that landed on others. Court records showed payments for information. The idea that a violent figure could supply tips to the government while running rackets unsettled observers, and later, after the war, that tie would be examined line by line. Meanwhile, offensive and defensive moves played out in real time. Agents bugged cars, watched stoops, and logged meetings. His name appeared on surveillance logs and in affidavits, a sign that those who had once valued his cooperation were also building cases that would name him among the prime movers of the conflict. Arrest followed. In 1992, federal prosecutors charged him under the racketeering statute with a package that reflected his life's work: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, transport of stolen goods, and violent offenses committed to protect the enterprise. The legal language stayed formal, but the stakes were plain. He faced decades behind bars at an age when each year weighed more than the last. Pretrial restrictions reduced his mobility. Friends in the street world counseled patience. Lawyers put in motions. He projected steadiness in court, the same reserve he had used across diner tables, but it was clear that the room he once navigated so easily had narrowed. As the case advanced, reporters dug into his past. Old allegations resurfaced, including the much-debated story that in 1964 he went to Mississippi at the request of federal officials to pressure a Ku Klux Klan member for information about 3 missing civil rights workers. The Bureau did not formally endorse that narrative, and scholars pointed out gaps, but the account had lived in books and articles for years and shaped public perception. To many, it looked like the emblem of a crooked bargain, a gangster who served as a source when it suited him and took what he needed from that access. The narrative complicated any simple storyline, and it put fresh scrutiny on the agents who had handled him longest. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to racketeering charges that incorporated multiple killings, conspiracies, and the financial backbone of his crew's day-to-day operations. The plea avoided a trial that could have run for months and spared co-defendants the uncertainty of testimony that would expose internal arrangements. Sentencing carried the weight of a life spent in organized crime. He received a long term that ensured he would never again walk Brooklyn blocks in the open air. He arrived at a federal medical facility with a body worn down by illness and years of strain, and for the first time since his youth, he no longer controlled the next hour of his day. He died in 1994 of AIDS-related complications at a federal medical center in Minnesota. The end arrived quietly, without the theater that surrounded so much of his life, and left behind a record that both sides of the law would study for what it said about power, fear, and the dangers of transactional alliances. His burial closed a chapter. It did not end the debate about how far the government should go in using violent informants to pursue larger targets, nor did it erase the damage he had done to men and families who had lived under his pressure for decades. After his passing, the ripples continued. His longtime companion, Linda Shiro, spoke to writers and prosecutors, claiming she had witnessed or been told about a long list of killings and inside tips. Years later, New York authorities charged his former FBI handler with crimes tied to the war, alleging that the agent had shared sensitive information that the capo exploited. The case collapsed after a judge found a key witness unreliable, and the agent's charges were dismissed. The dismissal didn't end the public reckoning. Books, documentaries, and investigative pieces continued to revisit the relationship, using it to question how an agency sworn to uphold the law had managed a source who thrived inside a violent crew. His son, Gregory Jr., followed him into organized crime and then into cooperation of a different kind. From prison, he supplied information to federal agents in several matters, including high-profile domestic terrorism cases, and later argued that his assistance had not been fairly credited. That arc underscored a family pattern, a belief that information could be turned into leverage, that even behind bars a well-placed tip might shift outcomes. The younger man generated headlines of his own and kept the Scarpa name in public view long after the father's funeral for reasons that had little to do with neighborhood rackets and everything to do with the government's complex reliance on sources who live 1 foot inside and 1 foot outside the law. When people tally his crimes, they point to the components of the enterprise he ran for most of his adult life. Extortion kept cash moving and dissent low. Loan sharking trapped borrowers who couldn't escape compounding interest. Illegal gambling created a constant stream of small profits that added up across seasons. Hijacked shipments and stolen property fed the network's appetite for goods without invoices. Acts of violence enforced discipline, silenced rivals, and settled scores inside a family that oscillated between uneasy peace and open war. The racketeering statute exists because prosecutors needed a way to describe, in a single frame, how a man like him drew power from multiple parts that reinforced one another. That is how he survived as long as he did, and how he fell when investigators finally assembled the parts into a picture a court could recognize. To those who knew him casually, he could seem like a polite neighbor with strong opinions about coffee and sports. To those who worked under him, he was the person who taught that fear could be administered in minute doses until a debtor never missed another payment. To agents who logged his tips, he was a source with rare proximity to decisions that shaped a volatile era in organized crime. To victims and rival crews, he represented the dark edge of a system that thrived on silence. All of these portraits can be true at once. They form a mosaic of a career built on leverage, secrecy, and a talent for reading rooms. The contradictions make simple judgments difficult, yet they do not change the fact that behind lawsuits, headlines, and arguments about informant ethics sit the very real harms caused by a lifelong enforcer whose influence stretched from Brooklyn to federal file cabinets and back again. His story, taken straight, contains enough without embellishment. A street-bred captain who turned discipline into currency, used a government relationship to manage risk, weathered a deadly family conflict, and ended his days under prison care. It reflects a broader truth about the world he inhabited. The structures of organized crime rely on predictability payments arriving on schedule, rules enforced without hesitation, pressures calibrated just right. He supplied that predictability to his superiors and demanded it from his crew. When illness and a war disrupted the pattern, he tried to reassert control through planning and alliances. Law enforcement, meanwhile, attempted to penetrate the pattern with surveillance, informants, and sweeping statutes. The collision was inevitable. In that collision, his legend hardened, his family fractured, and his name became shorthand for both the power of fear and the risks an institution takes when it bets on a violent man to illuminate an even bigger target. People still argue about how to weigh the scales. Some see him as proof that criminal enterprises can be dismantled when insiders talk. Others point to the damage done when those insiders are allowed to keep operating while they talk. Whatever side you take, the facts of his life are stubborn. He chose a path early, mastered the economics of pressure, and kept climbing until age, disease, and a racketeering case ended his run. The paperwork that recorded his plea and the simple line that marked his death in custody closed the official file. The lessons it contains keep traveling, carried by those who studied him up close and those who learned about him from a distance, all trying to understand how a man could live for so long in the space between law and crime and what it cost everyone he touched. The years after the Gallo turmoil left a quieter surface across Brooklyn's side streets, and that calm suited Gregory Scarpa. He had learned how to turn routine into protection. Meals at the same hour, calls made from the same payphones, unhurried walks that looked like errands and were, in fact, inspections of his small economy. He checked in with line runners who handled sports wagers, with bankers who kept track of daily numbers bets, and with collectors who visited shops that paid for his crew's presence. He did not sell himself as a tough man. He sold certainty. If a tavern owner paid on Thursday, he would not be bothered on Saturday. If a borrower kept current, the tone stayed polite. That was his promise, and his leverage. It kept cash steady, and saved him from theatrics that only drew attention. Inside the reorganized Colombo family, his reputation for creating order without noise brought steady advancement. He became the man others called when a delivery stalled at a loading dock, or a card game host complained that independent players were poaching. He handled grievances with short meetings in rooms with low ceilings, setting terms, gauging character, and assigning responsibility for missed payments. No one present mistook his restraint for softness. He never raised his voice when he could make a timetable. He never made a scene when a calendar could do the work. Trusted people observed how he moved and imitated his habits. Arrive early, park facing out, talk only long enough, leave nothing behind that could turn into evidence. He trained a small circle in that discipline, then expected them to pass it along. The business itself was a patchwork anyone who lived near it could recognize. Sports bettors placed calls in the afternoon and settled up on Mondays. A numbers runner took slips through the day and handed totals to a banker before dinner. A shopkeeper who wanted trouble kept away, paid a weekly fee, and put a word out that he was under protection. Loans went out at steep terms to people who believed short-term relief would outweigh long-term cost. He managed the flow and kept disputes from turning noisy. when merchandise moved off a truck without paperwork and into a warehouse where no questions were asked. He saw to it that everyone along the chain got what he had been told to expect. The outline is simple. The skill lies in enforcing it without chaos. At the same time, he nurtured the arrangement with federal agents that had started in the early 1960 seconds. He supplied pieces they could use. Who sat where at a meeting, which driver handled a sensitive errand when a gathering would occur at a social club. He offered enough to remain valuable and avoided anything that would ruin a lucrative stream for his crew. The Bureau classified him among its prized sources, the kind they called top echelon. Handlers changed, forms changed, the city's mood changed. He adapted. He picked up the rhythm of what agents wanted to hear and what they would never learn from him. He learned their phrasing, their caution, their need to verify everything twice. By the late 1970 seconds, one handler, R. Lindley DeVecchio, would figure prominently in his life, a tie that later drew hard scrutiny. In that period, however, the relationship felt to him like a shield that let him keep doing what he had always done. Allocate pressure, collect cash, and maintain a small empire within the larger structure. He was not the only ear the government listened to, and he knew that. He assumed rooms were watched, assumed lines might be tapped, and acted as though any sentence he spoke could be read back to him in court one day. That mindset gave him an edge. He tended to be the person who left first, the person who called from one block away rather than from the doorway, the person who remembered that the safest threat is the one you never have to repeat. To his crew, he preached restraint disguised as courtesy. To rivals, he sent messages that were clear without being loud. He kept that tone for decades, and it served him. By the mid-1970 seconds, he functioned as a captain, a man with earners under him, and an obligation to pass a share up the line to family leadership. With rank came exposure. He had to balance the ambitions of men in his crew with the demands of superiors who cared only that the river of money did not shrink. He split territories fairly enough to prevent resentment from turning into disobedience. He checked the habits of promising men who liked attention too much. He replaced unreliable collectors with stable ones. He adjusted routes. He kept crews from crossing paths with other families unless the potential profit outweighed the risk. He behaved like a careful manager because he understood that the difference between a durable crew and a tragic one was often a single, impulsive act. A home life ran alongside that schedule. He had children and, for many years, a companion, Linda Shiro, who lived the peculiar half-light of a household connected to a crew. Friends came and went at hours that made little sense, whispers were common, and certain topics died at the threshold. She would later describe conversations and admissions that turned into headlines, while her credibility in portions of those accounts would be challenged in court. That complexity mirrored his own. He liked the comfort of family dinners and the solitude of late-night drives. He was devoted to his children and expected his crew to keep their world separate from work. Those expectations, like many in his life, held until stress broke them. The 1980 seconds began with unease across the city's underworld. Federal prosecutors pressed conspiracy cases built on wiretaps, long indictments, and insiders who flipped. In the landmark commission case, bosses from multiple families faced sentences that signaled a new era. Within the Colombos, Carmine Persico fought his case and, after conviction, asserted control from prison. He remained the leader in Scarpa's mind, a point of loyalty that would define later choices. In that climate, Scarpa did what he always did. He kept income flowing by concentrating on core rackets. He put distance between his crew and high-visibility schemes. He focused on the business of betting, loans, and protection, the constant hum that kept phones ringing and kept his table set every week. Health interrupted that rhythm in the mid-1980 seconds. After surgery, he received a transfusion that, according to later filings and reports, transmitted HIV at a time when screening was imperfect and treatment rudimentary. He did not stop. He adjusted. He scheduled meetings earlier in the day when he felt stronger. He stood rather than sat when the room felt crowded. He minimized late-night rounds. He confided the truth to very few, using the privacy he had always cultivated to keep fear at bay. Colleagues noticed he had thinned. They changed the subject. They did not want to be the ones who reduced a feared man to a diagnosis. Even so, he built. A young man who had delivered groceries in the neighborhood became a trusted runner, then a collector, then something like a protege. That young man, Larry Mazza, would later surrender, cooperate with authorities, and describe the inner workings of Scarpa's crew in books and court. In the years when their partnership flourished, Mazza learned the same spare method Scarpa had refined. Keep calls short, make eye contact, ask for what is due. Leave before small talk turns into memory. The pair became a visible core around which others organized their days. Decision-making stayed at Scarpa's table, but he relied on a lattice of younger men for stamina and reach. Between 1989 and 1991, tension climbed inside the Colombo family. Victor Orena served as acting boss, while Persico remained behind bars. And what began as a temporary arrangement soured into a struggle. One side argued that stability and profits required a public reshuffling. The other held that the only stability that counted was loyalty to the man who had earned authority and intended to keep it. Men who had grown up together found themselves convening on separate sides of the same street. Old jokes thinned into careful silences. Anyone who spent hours in social clubs could feel that New York's most fractious family was moving toward a break. Scarpa was not a man who wavered. He planted firmly with the Persico faction. He did not rant about it. He did not give speeches. He held short meetings, issued instructions, and started moving pieces. Safe apartments became staging grounds. Cars were checked for tampering. Drivers ran loops around blocks to flush out followers. Envelopes that used to move through the same hands were redirected. Signals changed. Code words changed. A routine built over decades was reworked in a matter of weeks. He knew that survival in a break like this depended on good information, cautious movement, and the ability to keep earners focused when anxiety bends judgment. The government's view of what came next is documented in affidavits and prosecutions that followed. Agents described a campaign of planned strikes, retaliations, and ambush interdictions. Prosecutors said Scarpa monitored rivals' patterns, used his long-standing insight into people's habits, and chose moments when a sudden hit would disrupt the other side's momentum. Defense lawyers framed the same conduct as internal discipline in a fight he did not start. Civilians saw the headline shorthand: a war that turned commutes into source material for news anchors and pushed a clandestine subculture onto nightly broadcasts. The specifics entered the record through cooperating witnesses, state and federal trials, and plea agreements that mapped motive to event without dwelling on visceral detail. It was a violent chapter, and it played out while he was still running money-generating operations that had to keep humming or he would lose the very leverage that made him valuable. His dual role as both a veteran enforcer and a longtime informant made that period uniquely combustible. On one hand, he had years of experience feeding agents pieces they could verify. On the other, he had never stopped being the person who used pressure to steer outcomes. Journalists began to report that a source inside the Colombos had traveled for decades under bureau protection. As rumors thickened into published accounts, attention turned to the degree of contact between him and his primary handler. Former officials defended the program by pointing to the intelligence value of a high-level source. Critics argued that the relationship blurred lines and shielded someone who was driving violence in real time. The ethical questions, which would become an obsession years later, were already forming in the background, while the war was alive. On the street, strategy set the tone. Scarpa told his men to move during the day with purpose, avoid routes they had used twice in a row, and treat any coincidence as suspicious. He imposed schedules. He insisted that each runner report not only who they saw but also who they expected and did not see. He reminded old associates that nostalgia was a weakness. If someone from the other faction reached across a divide that had already hardened, the safest response was distance. He preferred planning to improvisation and encouraged his crew to do the same. He had survived this long by assuming that everyone, rivals, informers, and police, kept notebooks. He acted as though even a false lead could be dangerous if mishandled. All the while, the ordinary business that kept his faction funded continued. Card games still filled back rooms. Monday collections still covered the weekend's bets. Protection envelopes still moved on schedule. The conflict did not cancel the need for the behavior he valued most. Predictable payments, quiet cleanup, steady discipline. If the flow faltered, loyalties could crack. Men who lived on weekly thumbs of cash lost faith when cash missed its mark. To keep them engaged, he split proceeds in ways that rewarded patience. He also used favors: the free use of a car, a tip about a job site, a loan extended without interest for a month to knit his circle tighter. Money mattered, so did belonging. He understood both and kept them in balance until arrests and indictments began to thin the ranks. The city's legal apparatus adapted quickly. Wiretaps multiplied. Surveillance teams spread out from familiar club fronts to side streets in adjacent neighborhoods. Grand jury subpoenas forced reluctant witnesses to appear. Prosecutors packaged events together as racketeering, a framework that let them tell a story about an enterprise rather than a scattered collection of acts. His name featured often in those narratives, sometimes as a participant, sometimes as a planner, sometimes as the man other men feared disappointing. Defense counsel pushed back, arguing that informers shaded truth to secure leniency and that the line between factional rumor and fact was thin. Judges and juries weighed it case by case. Through those months, he leaned on a lifetime of habits. He looked for small tells: a car with a new dent in a place a magnet could be hidden, a look from a bartender who had always kept his eyes on the register, a neighbor pausing too long before saying hello. He changed the order of errands. He sent different pairs of men to places that had always been handled by the same team. He accepted that risk could not be eliminated, only shaped, and that his job was to give that risk as few openings as possible. He had been playing that game since he first collected a debt on a gray afternoon, and he had never stopped. By late 1991 and into 1992, the drumbeat of arrests accelerated. The war had cost the family dearly in manpower and attention. The government, having watched and recorded for months, began to pick up central figures. He was among them. His detention confronted him with a calculus he could no longer finesse with short phrases and steady looks. He had lived decades in motion, always leaving a room on his own timing. Now he sat in rooms where someone else set the clock. The life he had built on routine, restraint, and leverage had narrowed to schedules he did not control, filings he could only answer, and hearings where his presence depended on a deputy's nod. The consequences extended beyond him. The ongoing argument over informants, what they are allowed to do while they are in place, what handlers know, what is written down, what is left to trust, gained hard edges as people around him cut deals or faced trial. Old headlines about his alleged role in a 1964 civil rights search resurfaced and met skepticism from scholars and former agents. That dispute, like so many others linked to his name, showed how tangled the record had become. Meanwhile, his family tried to carry on with rhythms that had defined them. Children going to school, relatives handling errands, old friends deciding whether proximity still felt safe. A life organized around keeping worry out of the kitchen could not hold worry back any longer. He asked lawyers to keep him informed and pressed them to move faster. He kept certain confidences, even when it would have been easier to open his hands and let the pieces fall. He did not share every detail he could have shared. He did not ask for sympathy. He played the role he had always played, the one in which his tone and his gaze substituted for explanations. In the end, a courtroom requires different currency. Paper carries more weight there than reputation does, and the paper that built around him described a career in organized crime in plain terms: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, stolen goods, moving quietly down supply lines, and the planning and execution of violence to protect it all. The record marched toward an outcome that would remove him from the sidewalks he had owned for so long, ending a chapter that had started on stoops where a young man learned to listen, and crystallizing into the version of Gregory Scarpa that history would keep. The courthouse days that followed his arrest felt like a slow tunnel. He had spent decades deciding when to arrive and when to leave. Now marshals opened doors and a judge set the tempo. He met with counsel in small rooms, listened more than he spoke, and traced the likely arc of a long trial versus the certainty of a plea. The file assembled against him was dense. Ledgers, surveillance logs, cooperating witnesses, and wiretap notes that tied phone calls to meetings and meetings to outcomes. Age and illness weighed on every calculation. Pride pushed one way. Realism pushed the other. His lawyers explained the government's plan to present his life as a single enterprise. Rico moved events from different years and different boroughs into a single narrative. Extortion to keep payments on schedule. illegal gambling that spun around phones, loans with heavy terms, stolen goods routed through warehouses where night crews kept quiet, and acts of violence to preserve the whole machine. The state and federal teams had learned over time to knit stories from fragments, and the fragments in his case filled boxes. A trial promised months of testimony, a parade of people who had worked for him and against him, and the risk that crosswinds from the Colombo War would turn every day into a headline. He chose certainty. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to racketeering charges that incorporated killings, conspiracies, and the business backbone of his crew. The language in the courtroom was precise, the kind that leaves little room for flourish. He answered yes or no when required, looked at the judge, and accepted that control. The thing he had prized since his teens had narrowed to a few square feet at a defense table. Sentencing followed, severe enough to ensure he would spend the remainder of his life in custody. He was moved to a federal medical facility equipped to handle the illness he had been carrying in silence for years. Prison life is structure distilled. Wake when told, eat when told, wait for visiting days that arrive and vanish like slow tides. He adapted by shrinking his world to what he could influence. His conduct, his conversations, a routine that kept his head clear. Staff observed an older inmate who rarely complained and kept interactions short. He followed medical regimens that were still evolving, and he held on to familiar habits: an early rise, a steady walk, a focus on schedule. News from the street arrived in letters and visits, filtered through supervised glass and regulated time. In 1994, illness ended the story. He died at the Federal Medical Center, the final line in reports noting AIDS-related complications. There were no crowds, no speeches, just paperwork, a family grieving in private, and a circle of former associates absorbing the reality that a man they had treated as a fixed point would not be making calls anymore. The neighborhoods that had felt his presence adjusted quickly, the way cities do. A table in the back of a cafe went to someone else. A driver parked in a new spot. People spoke his name less often, then almost never in public. The cases did not end with him. Prosecutors continued to unwind the networks he had overseen, using records seized during searches and testimony from men who had decided prison years would be shorter if they traded detail for leniency. Larry Mazza, a younger associate who had spent years at his side, surrendered and began cooperating. In courtrooms and later in print, Mazza sketched the routines and rules he had learned, the brevity of meetings, the emphasis on predictable payments, the importance of seeming calm even when anxiety ran high. His account helped jurors, judges, and the wider public understand how a crew like Scarpa's functioned without relying on spectacle. Another voice from his past, Linda Shiro, also became part of the postscript. She went before grand juries and spoke to authors, describing confessions she said she had heard and episodes she claimed to have witnessed. She placed herself near sensitive conversations and offered a tally of killings she attributed to him. Years later, when a Brooklyn prosecutor brought a case against his former FBI handler, R. Lindley DeVecchio, her shifting statements led a judge to deem her too unreliable, and the charges against the agent were dismissed. That courtroom moment did not erase everything she had said in other venues, nor did it vindicate every allegation. It underscored how tricky memory and motive can be when the only records are people and the stakes are high. The DeVecchio prosecution, though dismissed, amplified an argument that had been simmering for years: how far law enforcement should go when managing violent sources. Scarpa had been a top echelon informant, a category the Bureau reserved for high-level figures whose access promised unusual insight. Supporters of the program pointed to cases solved, structure explained, and settings open to investigators who would never have gained access otherwise. Critics countered that the value extracted came at the cost of letting a dangerous man continue to operate, and that any flow of sensitive information toward him, even if not criminally proven, would have multiplied harm. Internal reviews weighed guidelines against messy facts. Books, documentaries, and inspectors' general reports turned the relationship into a study subject for anyone training to handle informants. A separate story that had long shadowed his name also returned to the spotlight. In 1964, during the desperate search in Mississippi for 3 missing civil rights workers, journalists and later authors reported that Scarpa traveled south at the quiet request of federal contacts and forced a local suspect to give up the location of the bodies. The FBI never formally confirmed that account, and historians have questioned details and sources. Still, the tale persisted for decades because it captured the strange bargains of that period. an agency under pressure turning to an unlikely tool, and a gangster with his own motives stepping into a crisis far from New York. However one judges its veracity, the episode illustrates the tangle that forms when expediency meets principle. His double life set patterns his family could not avoid. His son, Gregory Jr., entered the same world and later became a prison informant for federal authorities. From behind bars in the mid-1990s, he provided intelligence in high-profile terrorism probes, including information tied to Ramzi Youssef, a figure linked to the first World Trade Center bombing. The younger Scarpa argued for years that the assistance he supplied had not been fairly credited at sentencing. Prosecutors disputed parts of his account, and litigation followed. The son's arc brought the family name into an entirely different set of headlines, and it reinforced a theme. In that household, information was treated as a form of currency, something to be saved, traded, and spent when leverage was scarce. Beyond the courtroom drama, a quieter reckoning unfolded in the neighborhoods where he had operated. Small businesses that once paid for protection adjusted to life without his collectors. Some had relief. Others found that the next crew in line was less predictable. State-run lotteries had already thinned the classic numbers racket, but illegal betting did not vanish. It adapted, leaning on convenience, credit, and long-standing relationships that state tickets could not replace. Sports betting stayed lively, and card games kept their draw in back rooms where familiarity mattered more than decor. What changed was the temperature. Without his emphasis on restraint, some operators grew careless, and attention followed. He had always used legitimate fronts to smooth cash flow. Bars and social clubs as places to meet, small distribution businesses to explain trucks that came and went at odd hours, occasional real estate plays that turned cash into assets. Investigators picked apart those structures in forfeiture actions, tracing deposits and transfers with far more precision than was common when he started in the 1,950 seconds. That financial scrutiny, combined with witness cooperation, made it harder for successors to rebuild the same patterns at the same scale. The era of envelopes on counters gave way to a world where even routine bank activity could invite subpoenas. His influence in labor did not end with a single union or trade. Over the years, he had learned how to pull on levers in trucking, construction, and related services. Who could slow a delivery, who could delay a pour, who could add costs without raising voices. Those quiet pressures translated to money, and that money translated to standing inside the family. Prosecutors did not always spell out each lever and charges, but the logic of influence ran through the cases that followed. New York's broader underworld shifted too. Federal campaigns against the commission and long sentences for top bosses weakened systems that had once felt unshakable. Younger figures tried to fill gaps. The old predictability never quite returned. The nickname newspapers attached to him late in life, grim and theatrical, came not from the way he spoke, but from the way people spoke about him. He did not trade on labels. He traded on outcomes. A shop that paid on time stayed open. A borrower who honored terms kept his schedule. A rival who overstepped receded. The press, looking for shorthand, turned that reputation into a moniker. The label stuck because it fit the chill people described, not because it captured any secret worldview. In private, he was spare with words, fond of routine, and focused on consistency rather than drama. For investigators and students of organized crime, his case became a seminar in the promise and peril of using criminals as sources. On one side of the ledger sits intelligence that helped map crews, decode language, and time arrests. On the other sits the moral cost of relying on a man who continued to commit crimes during periods of cooperation. The dismissal of charges against his handler did not end the debate. Internal guidelines grew stricter, documentation requirements hardened, and training stressed the risks of dependence on any single asset. Scarpa's file, thick with memos and payments, turned into a cautionary binder passed around classrooms. What remains after you set aside the mythology is a career built on 4 pillars. Extortion, which he framed as keeping the peace, supplied regular income, and suppressed disputes. Loan sharking created obligations that rarely ended, producing interest that felt permanent. Illegal gambling produced steady revenue with low overhead. Theft and resale of goods moved profit through warehouses and docks out of public view. Violence hung over everything as enforcement, but he preferred the threat to the act, fear to force, schedule to spectacle, That preference kept him free for longer than many of his peers, and explains why some business owners regarded him as a troubling kind of stability. The Colombo conflict at the start of the 1,990 seconds drained energy from all of those pillars. The family spent attention on survival instead of profit, and that shift provided openings for law enforcement. Wiretaps that had been difficult to obtain came easier when judges saw a war playing out in headlines. Jurors, asked to weigh credibility, looked at cooperating witnesses not as isolated figures but as people stepping out of a context that was now painfully public. Scarpa's long relationship with federal agents made him an irresistible subject for reporters, and every new article pushed the story beyond the city, turning a Brooklyn feud into a national conversation about means and ends. After his death, people who had only known him by sight tried to rewrite their memories around what they read. The man at the corner table became the figure in the evening news. The neighbor whose quiet voice and regular tip were recast against a backdrop of indictments and memoirs. That is how public stories work. Each new fact rearranges old impressions. Those who had worked under him weighed loyalty against their own futures. Some stayed silent and served out sentences. Others spoke to authorities, wrote books, or moved away to start over in places where the name carried no history. Looking back, the through line is not glamour but calculation. He learned as a teenager to listen more than talk, to use routine as cover, and to make fear do the work of force whenever possible. He adapted as law enforcement adapted, shifting after major prosecutions, keeping his crew's activities in channels he believed would attract least attention. He balanced that pragmatism with an unusual pact with the government that gave him advantages and exposed him to harsh scrutiny. In the end, the same instincts that preserved him secrecy, minimal speech, leverage, could not outlast a system built to connect small pieces into a single picture. For families who lived under his reach, the harm was not abstract. Weekly payments reduced margins, debt turned hopeful loans into burdens, and the hum of phone-in betting turned into pressure when Mondays came due. For rivals, he represented a boundary that did not move. For federal agents, he was both a window and a headache, a source who explained a world they needed to understand, and a reminder that information rarely comes without cost. To himself, he was a manager, a stabilizer, a man who made other men keep their promises. Those self-definitions collapsed under the weight of the courtroom, but they help explain how he walked so long in the space he created. A story like his invites conclusions. Some say his cooperation showed the only way complex organizations can be dismantled. Others argue that the tolerance shown to him extended pain for years longer than necessary. The truth likely lives between those positions. He taught agencies, communities, and his own successors something about the price of ambiguity. He left behind paper, questions, and caution, a legacy composed not only of crimes charged and admitted, but of the hard discussions that followed. New York moved on, as it always does, but the lessons stayed in the files and in the memories of those who watched him turn information into power until the very end. His world always ran on schedules, and those schedules were the spine of everything he built. Monday reconciled weekend wagers, Tuesday settled numbers tallies, midweek brought loan payments due, Thursday moved protection envelopes, Friday lined up cash for bosses who expected punctual tribute. He learned early that a predictable week kept tempers low and kept police interest dispersed. He picked people who could live by calendars, not adrenaline. In rooms where clocks mattered, he spoke softly, repeated nothing, and closed conversations before they grew into stories someone might remember too clearly. That discipline, not any burst of bravado, explains how he lasted across decades that broke louder men. Extortion in his hands looked like conflict prevention. He presented it as keeping the peace, the price of business paid to avoid vandalism, theft, or menacing visits at closing time. Owners who paid saw problems drift away. Owners who hesitated found delays at delivery, pushy strangers at the door, or a rumor that a break-in might be coming. The point was not spectacle. The point was compliance. He preferred a nod at the end of a short meeting to any scene that might frighten customers or attract police. Over time, word traveled. Paying on schedule meant quiet nights. Missed payments meant headaches. The law called it extortion. He called it stability. Loan sharking ran beside that stream. People in a pinch asked for cash, believing they would catch up in a week or two. Terms never favored the borrower. Interest compounded quickly, Deadlines tightened, and a small debt became a burden that stretched across seasons. He assigned level-headed collectors to sensitive clients and adopted a tone that made payment feel inevitable. No one needed to shout if a ledger told the story. When someone fell behind, he offered a revised plan that still advantaged his side. The borrower signed on because the alternative felt worse. Courts later spelled this out in dry language. Those who lived it remembered the sensation of every Monday arriving with a heavier weight than the last. Gambling revenues provided a constant hum. Numbers bets moved through neighborhoods that trusted the ritual more than official lotteries ever could. Sports wagering soared and dipped with seasons. He matched limits to hosts, the way a careful manager matches workloads to staff, and he placed quiet people behind the phones. Sheets were reconciled with simple math and quick eyes. He preferred cash kept in motion rather than piled in one place, and he treated every hub as if it might be observed. Success depended on invisibility. A card room that never drew a complaint could run for years. A noisy one lasted weeks before a raid, or a call to a precinct captain brought unpleasant attention. Stolen property and hijacked shipments added another layer. Goods that left a truck at a side stop found their way into warehouses with few questions and steady lights. He knew dispatchers who could mislabel a route, drivers who would not ask why a pallet shifted mid-run, and small retailers who valued price over provenance. He did not flood one market, because glut invites eyes. He spread sales, kept margins acceptable, and ensured that everyone along the path had reason to stay quiet. When investigators later described theft from interstate shipments, they were naming a pattern he had treated as routine logistics. Influence inside unions turned timing into leverage. A job site could slow to a crawl with one phone call about an absent crew. A delivery could miss a window and sit at a dock because a foreman decided inspections would be extra careful that day. He did not need a title inside a union hall to make those choices happen. He needed relationships and a record of keeping his word. Contractors who wanted smooth weeks knew to reach out. He set terms that kept conflict off the front page and put a price on serenity. The money went up the chain on time, which preserved his standing with bosses who measured loyalty by totals, not slogans. All of these moving parts fed the structure that prosecutors would later call an enterprise. He rose to capo because he made the whole machine feel steady. His earners mirrored his manner. Meetings stayed short. No one called attention to themselves. Drivers avoided vanity cars, wore simple clothes, and learned the same old habit. Park with the nose out. Never linger. Assume every place you enter has been entered by others before you. These small choices made raids less likely. They did not guarantee safety, but they cut risk to the bone. Running parallel to that street life, he built a long relationship with federal agents that set him apart. He began giving information in 1963, a time when the FBI's understanding of organized crime still had gaps. They paid for verifiable tips, the kind that confirmed a meeting date, a seating chart, a car tied to a specific job. He did not deliver dramatic confessions. He delivered tiny pieces that fit like pebbles in a mosaic. He learned what agents could use, what they could verify, and how to keep his own revenue streams untouched by the tips he shared. Over the years, he became one of the Bureau's top echelon informants. Memos documented payments. Handlers shifted. The pattern held: give enough to protect himself, never enough to dismantle his own crew. Stories about one exceptional episode kept his name in national debates. During the 1964 search for 3 slain civil rights workers in Mississippi, multiple authors and reporters later claimed he was flown south at the quiet request of federal contacts and pressured a local extremist into disclosing the burial site. The FBI never formally embraced that account, and historians have argued over sources and specifics. The narrative lingered anyway, because it captured the strange calculations of that era, an agency under national pressure, allegedly turning to a criminal source whose methods were outside the law. Whether the story is precise or exaggerated, it fixed him in the public mind as a figure who straddled 2 worlds to an unusual degree. The most controversial part of that straddle involved his later bond with a single handler, Agent R. Lindley DeVecchio. As years passed, critics argued that the relationship blurred professional limits, alleging that sensitive information flowed in ways that advantaged him on the street. DeVecchio denied wrongdoing, retired, and in 2007 saw state charges against him dismissed after a judge found that a central witness, Scarpa's longtime companion, Linda Shiro, had given inconsistent accounts in the past and could not be trusted. The dismissal did not end the argument. It sharpened it. Training programs for agents began to cite the case as a lesson in documentation, oversight, and the danger of dependence on any one source. When the Colombo family split in the early 1992s, his experience with pressure and his deep knowledge of routines made him central. He sided with Carmine Persico's camp and took on planning that prosecutors later described as a methodical campaign to blunt the rival faction's momentum. He set up safe apartments for meetings, rotated cars, rewrote daily routes, and shortened every conversation. He focused on timing, because timing is what conflict distorts. Through sworn testimony and surveillance summaries, the government tied him to decisions that led to bloodshed. Defense lawyers challenged informers' motives and stressed the chaos of war. The public saw headlines and evening reports that turned an internal feud into a citywide story. Even in those months, the core business kept moving, because money was the tool that held his side together. He made sure gamblers settled up, ensured protection fees arrived on schedule, and kept loan payments flowing. He used small, steady favors to maintain morale: a temporary car, a quiet word to ease a relative's job trouble, a rent extension. People rally to leaders who solve concrete problems. In that sense, he was a practical leader rather than a romantic one, someone who saw cash flow as the true measure of rank during a crisis. Health concerns complicated everything. After surgery in the mid-1982s, he contracted HIV from a transfusion. According to court filings and news reports from the period, treatment options then were limited. He did not broadcast the diagnosis. He adjusted his days, moved meetings earlier, delegated late-night work to younger men, and kept his outward tone unchanged. Those who saw him regularly noticed weight loss and fatigue, but still registered the same reserve and the same insistence on punctuality. Illness did not soften his methods. It compressed them. His closest relationships reveal the human texture behind the headlines. He maintained a household and, for many years, kept a relationship with Linda Shiro, who later spoke publicly about life with him. She described admissions of serious crimes and the steady rhythm of a home linked to a crew, though her credibility later took a blow in court. He also formed a bond with Larry Mazza, a younger associate who started as a delivery worker in the neighborhood and grew into a trusted aide. Mazza later cooperated with authorities and offered detailed portraits of Scarpa's management style. Nonverbal cues, clipped orders, and the belief that a few steady rules could govern a chaotic trade. Those accounts helped courts and the public see how routine, rather than fireworks, powered his crew. Family ties crossed into the world of cooperation in a different way through his son, Gregory Jr. After his own arrest, the younger Scarpa provided information to federal agents from inside prison. He offered intelligence on high-profile terrorism targets in the mid-1990s, including insights related to Ramzi Youssef, linked to the first World Trade Center bombing. He later argued that his warnings helped illuminate parts of broader plots, and that the assistance should have earned him a lighter sentence. Prosecutors countered some claims, and the debate moved into filings that kept the family name in the news for reasons far from Brooklyn street corners. The pattern held information as leverage, even inside a cell. Media attention never sat at the center of his life while he was active, yet after his death it became a second stage. Books examined his years as a source, parsed FBI memos, and interviewed former associates who now wanted to explain how a man could serve the government for decades while running a crew involved in extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, theft, and directed violence. Documentaries looked at the Colombo War through his choices. Feature stories explored the ethical questions raised by his informant status. In classrooms, his file became a case study on both organized crime and informant management. The neighborhoods where he had operated adjusted with a shrug that city's perfect. Shops that once paid weekly saw new faces ask for the same envelopes. Some found relief when attention shifted elsewhere. Others learned that replacements were less disciplined, making trouble louder than before. Official lotteries weakened the numbers racket, but could not replace the familiarity of a local runner who extended credit and forgave a bad week now and then. Sports betting evolved. Technology changed. The old phone banks thinned. In that sense, His story sits at the hinge between eras. A man who thrived on analog habits in an age that would soon track money with precision and calls with timestamps. When prosecutors tallied his crimes in indictments, and during his 1993 plea, they placed them under racketeering because the statute captures the whole, not only the parts. Extortion to keep shops in line, interest schemes that trapped borrowers, bookmaking that converted obsession into weekly revenue, theft from shipments that fed gray markets, acts of violence planned and executed to defend the enterprise and to prevail in a family conflict that made the city nervous for months. He accepted responsibility within that framework, received a sentence that anticipated he would die in custody, and in 1994 he did, of AIDS-related complications, at a federal medical center in Minnesota. What remains useful about studying him is not a nickname or the aura that newspapers pinned on him. It is the clarity with which his choices illustrate how organized crime survives. By enforcing timetables, exploiting human need, inserting pressure where oversight is weak, and masking everything under ordinary routines. It also clarifies the toughest question in policing that world: whether the intelligence gained from a violent insider ever justifies the harm that insider continues to inflict. His life does not offer an easy answer. It offers a ledger profits balanced against victims, cases advanced against rules bent, and a reminder that every alliance of convenience carries a cost that someone will pay later. His end did not tidy the story. Associates faced sentences and chose silence or cooperation. Families rebuilt in new boroughs. Agents reviewed policies and added layers of approval for sensitive sources. Writers tried to weigh rumor against record. In that milling crowd of voices, one theme keeps returning. He believed that control came from routine. For decades, that belief served him. In the end, the routines he built could not outlast an enterprise reimagined by prosecutors, a family at war with itself, and a body worn down by time and illness. The streets where he walked kept moving. The file with his name on it stayed open in minds and libraries, caution written between every line. By the time investigators opened old files and reporters started stitching together sources, the outline of his life was easier to see than it had ever been when he was free. Paperwork turned rumors into dates, payments into entries, meetings into logs. His name sat on FBI memos as a paid source going back to 1963. The Bureau's own labels put him in rare company, a top echelon informant, someone whose proximity to decision-makers promised a view that microphones could rarely reach. Those memos do not read like legend. They read like office work amounts dispersed, times recorded, subjects covered. In their spare language, you can trace how he survived. He parceled out bits the government could verify while protecting the machinery that fed his crew. That machinery was never a secret to people who lived near it. A bar that stopped paying saw deliveries run late and repairs take longer than anyone could explain. A shop that stayed current found evenings calm. Borrowers who believed a loan would bridge a rough patch discovered how fast interest stacks when terms are set by men who watch payments like hawks. Gamblers called in bets because calling felt like habit as much as hope, then settled on Mondays with the same mix of pride and resignation that kept the cycle going. The work did not shout. It breathed. He liked it that way, because attention is the tax that destroys businesses like his. When the 1,960 seconds bled into the 1,970 seconds, change arrived without warning labels. Joseph Profaci's death and Joseph Colombo's rebranding of the family rearranged names on paper, not the rules on the street. He kept his habits. He treated fear as a tool to be used sparingly. He let other men raise their voices while he checked ledgers. He showed younger earners how to recognize the difference between a customer having a bad week and a man looking to test limits. Those lessons moved through his circle until they felt like common sense. You could spot his training in the way a collector paused before speaking, or the way a driver parked with the nose out, ready to leave if the wrong car turned the corner. What made his story unusual, what keeps it alive in arguments about law enforcement to this day, was the way that quiet streetcraft ran alongside a paid relationship with federal agents. The line between informant and operator is dangerous to walk. He did it for years. Why he started remains a subject of debate. Self-preservation, cash, leverage in a world where leverage keeps a man ahead of disappointments. Whatever the motive, He learned the Bureau's rhythms and fed them the kind of detail that made case files feel solid without collapsing his income. In turn, some agents learned to trust him as a source who rarely wasted their time. That trust, documented in memos and payments, would later draw intense scrutiny, especially when his name surfaced in connection with the bloodiest chapter of the Colombo family's history. Even before that, one contested story attached him to a national tragedy far from New York. In 1964, 3 civil rights workers vanished in Mississippi. Search teams combed rivers and fields. Later accounts by journalists and authors claimed he traveled south at the quiet urging of federal contacts and pressed a local extremist until the burial site was disclosed. The FBI never formally endorsed that version, and historians have challenged pieces of it, but the narrative persisted because it captured a truth about the times. Authorities under pressure sometimes reached for tools they would not acknowledge in public. Whether he forced a confession or confirmed details gathered elsewhere, the tale welded his name to an era when expediency and principle collided in the open. Back home, his ascent continued. He became a captain, ran a crew, and established a style that made outsiders call him cold and insiders call him reliable. He solved problems with timetables. He settled arguments with arithmetic. He brokered favors like a banker. Money moved up the chain on schedule, which mattered more than rhetoric ever could. He cultivated union contacts who could slow a project without a fight, and he placed collectors with the right temper in the right rooms. He removed men who liked applause more than results. He was shaping a culture, quiet, punctual, unsentimental. Illness arrived as a private shock in the mid-1980 seconds. After surgery, he received a transfusion that, according to court filings and reporting at the time, left him HIV positive, just as the country was learning what that diagnosis meant. Treatments were new and limited. Stigma was heavy. He confined the news to a tiny circle and changed his routine rather than his persona. Meetings moved to mornings. Younger men handled late hours. He still showed at his usual spots when he could, looked the same way across a table, and spoke in the same compressed sentences that left nothing for anyone to repeat. He would not let frailty become a topic. His mentorship of younger figures, especially Larry Mazza, gave his methods a second life beyond his own years. Mazza began with errands, graduated to collections and other sensitive work, then became a constant presence. He absorbed the philosophy that efficiency beats drama. Call from a block away rather than at the door. Keep a meeting as long as it takes to convey a point. And no longer. Stress a due date rather than a threat. When Mazza later cooperated with authorities and wrote about that apprenticeship, he offered a rare inside look at a crew designed to leave the smallest possible footprint while still enforcing rules that no one mistook for suggestions. The Colombo split in the early 1990 seconds over succession and control shattered any illusion that old routines could ride out every storm. Victor Orena, serving as acting boss while Carmine Persico remained in prison, gathered support for a change that Persico loyalists refused to accept. Scarpa planted on Persico's side and became a strategist during a period when strategy and survival were the same thing. Safe apartments turned into war rooms. Cars and drivers rotated. Phone habits were rewritten. Code words changed. He tried to keep morale anchored to revenue because in his world cash and confidence travel together. Prosecutors later tied him to key decisions in that conflict, presenting a narrative built from surveillance, informants, and the cadence of events that shook Brooklyn and Staten Island. They said he picked times and places with care, used his hard-won sense of routine to predict rivals' movements, and directed operations that removed Orena loyalists from the street. Among the names that surfaced in filings and testimony were Nicholas Grancio, John Minerva, and Michael Imbergamo, figures whose deaths became markers on the war's timeline. Defense counsel contested motivations and cast doubt on witnesses who had traded testimony for leniency. The courts did what courts do. They sifted paper and voices and reached conclusions case by case, charge by charge, without delving into grisly detail. At the same time, his role as an FBI source complicated every frame the public saw. Reporters discovered that he had been paid for years and classified among the Bureau's most valuable informants. Questions hardened. What did handlers know about his ongoing activity? What should they have known? And did the relationship go beyond the guarded exchange of intelligence? into improper sharing of sensitive information. Those questions focused on one agent in particular, R. Lindley DeVecchio, who had worked with him for years. In 2007, state prosecutors charged DeVecchio with crimes tied to Scarpa, alleging that the flow of information had aided violent outcomes. Mid-trial, the case collapsed when the judge ruled that a key witness, his longtime companion, Linda Shiro, had given contradictory accounts in the past and could not be relied upon. Charges were dismissed. The dismissal didn't erase the issue. It became a touchstone for every class, audit, and policy review that asked how to manage dangerous sources without becoming dependent on them. His own prosecution moved faster than the debate around it. In 1992, he was arrested on racketeering charges that treated his life's work as a single enterprise: extortion to keep money moving, bookmaking that turned calendars into revenue maps, loans that trapped borrowers, theft and resale of goods, and planned violence to protect it all. The government's case stacked documents and witnesses until the likely outcome was plain. In 1993, he pleaded guilty. The sentence ensured he would spend the rest of his life in custody. In 1994, at a federal medical center in Minnesota, he died of AIDS-related complications. The end was quiet. The arguments were not. After his death, strands of his story moved on their own. Maz's cooperation added detail to the public record and to academic studies of organized crime. Skyro's interviews and grand jury appearances kept sparking headlines, even as courts questioned parts of her accounts. The DeVecchio case turned training manuals into cautionary tales. His son, Gregory Jr., extended the family's complicated relationship with the government by becoming a prison informant in high-profile terrorism matters, including intelligence connected to Ramzi Youssef after the first World Trade Center bombing. The younger Scarpa argued that his help deserved more credit than it received. Prosecutors disputed aspects. Filings flew. The name that once hovered over betting parlors and union halls now appeared in stories about national security and the ethics of jailhouse sources. On the street level, his absence changed tone more than structure. People still gambled. Borrowers still sought relief that turned costly. Protection rackets never vanished. They adjusted. What did change was the predictability he had enforced. Some successors prized intimidation over order, noise over scheduling. That noise drew attention. Police who once treated certain blocks as low priority because disturbances were rare began to notice calls. Regulators who had learned to watch banks for odd deposits grew better at tracing money that once seemed invisible. Technology made old camouflage thinner. He had worked in an era that favored habits and face-to-face arrangements. The era that followed favored records. His case also fed a broader reassessment inside law enforcement. The Department of Justice tightened guidelines for handling informants, added layers of review, and emphasized documentation strong enough to withstand public scrutiny. Supervisors began to ask for more frequent evaluations of a source's ongoing crimes, and for clear lines on what a handler could and could not reveal. In those discussions, his file sat alongside others that showed how easily a partnership can tilt from useful to compromised if watchfulness fades. It is not that agencies stopped using violent insiders they could not. The access matters. It is that they became more careful about how to balance what they gain against what they risk. If you set aside the heat of the war years and the glare of the informant controversy, you see a man whose instincts were simple and relentless. Keep schedules. Use fear like a metronome, not a hammer. Reward punctuality. Punish unpredictability. Trust as few people as possible. Listen more than you speak. Those habits carried him from small errands under Profaci to stewardship under Persico to the center of a fight that pulled a private subculture into living rooms across the city. Those same habits could not protect him once the government learned to tell his story in a single frame and present it under the racketeering statute that had grown teeth just as he reached old age. His legacy lives in two conversations that rarely meet. One is the neighborhood version, told by people who remember a quiet man whose presence lowered the temperature in rooms where nerves ran hot and who learned that paying on time meant closing up at night without a hitch. The other is the institutional version, told by investigators and lawyers who see him as a case study in both organized crime's durability and law enforcement's complicated bargains. In both versions, the damage he caused is real. Families who lost loved ones, businesses that bled margin for years, debtors whose lives narrowed under obligations designed never to end. The order he provided some storefronts came at a cost that never appeared on a receipt. Pop culture turned his contradictions into material. Books dissected the FBI's top echelon program and used his career to test its limits. Documentaries traced the Colombo feud, pausing on his role as planner and paymaster. Interviews with former associates sketched a man who could be patient over coffee and merciless in calendars. Even the disputed Mississippi episode kept getting retold. Not because every detail convinced skeptics, but because the idea of a New York enforcer parachuting into the South at a moment of national tension captures the uneasy trades Americans sometimes make with themselves when fear and urgency run the table. What his life offers, in the end, is clarity about how power works at street level and how institutions respond. He understood that people crave routine and that many will pay to keep their days undisturbed. He built a business around that truth, wrapped it in secrecy, and for decades eluded the clumsy kind of attention that topples less disciplined men. The government, slow at first, learned to write his story in a courtroom's language, to convert whispers into exhibits, and to turn the very predictability he prized into proof that a crime family functions like a company. Between those arcs sits the informant thread, the most troubling strand, a paid partnership that produced insight and, some argue, protected its source longer than public trust should allow. He is gone. But the questions attached to his name are not. How do you stop a system that hides inside ordinary days, without the help of people who live inside it? When you accept that help, how do you draw lines tight enough to keep the helper from doing more harm? What do you owe the victims while you're making those trades? His file doesn't give easy answers. It gives examples, caution, and a map of choices that look clean only to people who have never had to make them. For people who grew up on the blocks where he walked, the lessons were simpler. Schedules can be a kind of prison. Silence can be a currency, and the man who knows both can hold a city's attention long after his voice has fallen quiet. By the time archives grew thick and memories thinned, the city had already filed him away as both a headline and a caution. People who had once crossed streets to avoid him now crossed generations to tell versions of what they remembered. A nod at a doorway. A car that idled just long enough to be noticed. A bar that stayed orderly when every other place on the block felt unpredictable. Those small images, passed around kitchen tables, matched the paper trail investigators pieced together after his death. Memos showed payments for intelligence stretching back to the Kennedy years. Indictments mapped the backbone of his work: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, theft tied to shipments, conspiracies, and killings, used to enforce rules into a single frame that courts could read. Nothing in that paperwork shouted. It simply stacked details until the picture was unmistakable. Researchers who dug into his life found a pattern that explained both longevity and downfall. He consolidated power through routine, not charisma, then hid that power inside habits that looked plain to anyone not trained to see them. A week had its rituals. Calls placed, envelopes delivered, quiet bargaining with union contacts who could speed or slow a job site without a scene. That cadence kept his crew fed and his bosses satisfied, while rivals misread restraint for softness. It also created a ledger that prosecutors later used to show a continuing enterprise. The very regularity he had trusted turned into proof. Books took the record and tried to give it shape. One volume explored the father-son dynamic in a family where leverage felt like inheritance. Another probed the informant partnership that tied him to his most consequential FBI handler. Still others placed his crew within the larger history of New York's families. Larry Mazza's account added daily texture. Brief meetings, quiet rules. Small tells that signaled risk. Reporters traced how a kid from Brooklyn became a captain with reach across boroughs, while also serving as a long-running source who left agents with notes that would later be evidence. Scholars folded his case into lectures on RICO, showing students how prosecutors convert fragments, bets, debts, delivery hiccups, warehouse transactions into a story about structure. Policy shifted under the weight of those stories. The Department of Justice rewrote guidelines for confidential informants, tightened approvals, insisted on clear documentation for high-risk sources, and required periodic reviews of ongoing criminal activity. Supervisors started treating relationships like his as delicate machines in need of constant inspection. The lesson echoed across field offices. Information matters. Oversight matters more. His file became Exhibit A in seminars, where young agents learned how a partnership can drift from useful to compromised if boundaries blur or paperwork cannot answer hard questions. Families who had kept their worries private began to speak in measured ways about the cost of living under a system that pretended to offer security for a price. A shopkeeper described the relief of closing up without glancing at the door, paid for weekly out of revenue that could have gone to hiring help or repairing a cooler. A borrower recounted how an emergency loan ballooned into a trap that altered every decision for years. People linked to rivals spoke of seeing lines harden during the Colombo War, then soften only after arrests removed familiar faces from corners where they had stood for decades. Behind all of it lay a simple arithmetic: money in exchange for quiet, fear in exchange for compliance, routine in exchange for control. Inside law enforcement, his name turned up in internal debates anytime a case involved a source with real access and real danger. One side pointed to indictments and dismantled crews as proof that without insiders, secretive networks stay hidden. The other side pointed to him as proof that reliance can curdle into tolerance if watchfulness slips. The collapsed state case against his handler, dropped after a key witness lost credibility on the stand, did not settle anything. It taught a narrower lesson: courts need reliable testimony, and left the ethical puzzle intact. Even when guidelines get sharper, choices made under pressure remain messy. Years after his funeral, a few of his old haunts still carried whispers. A table in a cafe where he once met earners now hosted commuters who never knew the history. A back room that had hummed on Sundays fell silent, then reopened as a small office where invoices replaced bedding sheets. Some businesses that had paid for calm found new rhythms without envelopes. Others encountered replacements who lacked his restraint, which drew attention he would have considered sloppy. The city he worked in changed too. Legal gambling expanded. Technology tracked cash in ways that once felt impossible, and smartphones made face-to-face secrecy harder to sustain. He had thrived on analog habits. The digital world eroded that camouflage. The legal portrait of his career stayed consistent across cases. A captain who enforced order through predictable pressure while he collected protection fees, managed bookmaking, extended loans on harsh terms, moved stolen goods, and directed or carried out violence tied to those pursuits. Prosecutors repeated this scaffolding because it fit the facts. Defense counsel countered by attacking witnesses' motives and highlighting the chaos of factional conflict, especially during the early 1990 seconds. Judges filtered both sides into rulings that now read like distillations of a long era, old structures proving resilient until sustained federal attention finally broke them down. His health story, which had stayed private in life, became part of the public record only as filings referenced a transfusion in the mid-1980 seconds that, according to those documents, left him HIV positiva. The timing mattered because it showed a man trying to maintain control while his body argued otherwise, relying on younger men to carry out duties he used to handle personally. Observers who had once thought of him as immovable adjusted their memories. Illness did not explain choices, but it revealed stakes, and it helped explain why a plea made more sense than a grueling trial that would have lasted longer than his strength. The Mississippi episode remained a contested chapter. Some journalists and authors insisted that he flew south at Federal, urging in 1964, and used illegal pressure to locate 3 slain civil rights workers. The Bureau never formalized that account, and historians poked holes where sourcing felt thin. The persistence of the story showed how myth grows when secrecy meets urgency. Whether strictly true or partly apocryphal, the tale placed him at the intersection of law and lawlessness in a way that even his most routine days in Brooklyn never could. It became an afterimage, hard to erase, easy to invoke during arguments about means and ends. His son's arc pushed the name into different corridors. Gregory Jr. acted as a jailhouse source during the mid-1990 seconds, supplying information in terrorism matters that reached well beyond the family business. He later insisted that his help deserved more credit than it received, a claim that kept courts busy and newspapers interested. The echo was unmistakable. Information treated as currency across a generation, traded for advantage inside institutions that needed it. In one household, cooperation was not only a tactic, it had become a philosophy, a way to turn proximity into leverage, even without freedom of movement. Former associates carried his lessons into lives that diverged sharply. Some served long sentences quietly. Others cooperated, and tried to build new identities far from their old zip codes. Maz's book landed on shelves where academic studies and memoirs share space, offering students and curious readers a grounded view of how discipline can run a crew more effectively than bravado. Those accounts did not romanticize. They explained. They showed how brief words, controlled timetables, and consistent expectations can hold an enterprise together until external pressure finally pries the pieces apart. Comparisons to scandals in other cities crept into essays that used his case to measure scale and failure. Boston's saga with its own notorious informant became a counterpoint, proof that the problems of managing dangerous sources were not local quirks but national challenges. More auditors visited field offices, more training included hypotheticals about conflicts of interest. More supervisors insisted that sensitive sources be subjected to structured reviews. If a single name can move policy, his did, not because he sought the spotlight, but because the contradictions in his file were impossible to ignore. Set against that institutional churn, the human equation remained stark. Every racketeering case lists victims without telling their full stories. A store owner who cut corners to afford a weekly envelope, a driver whose job became a secret he carried home, a family who lost a relative during a war they never chose to join. His career grew on the back of those costs, even while it offered some people a sense that rules existed in neighborhoods where the official system felt slow or indifferent. That trade stability purchased through fear defines organized crime more clearly than any label ever could. In the legal sense, he reached an ending. A plea, a sentence, a death in custody. In narrative terms, no clean line exists. Debates about informant management still cite him. Documentaries still loop in his wartime role. Business histories of the city still pause on how illegal gambling adapted when state lotteries and later legal sports books changed the market. Students still encounter his name in case studies about racketeering, transparency, and the power of routine to both conceal and reveal. The city moved on, but the questions he raised attached themselves to every strategy meeting where urgency threatens to outrun caution. Take away headlines, and what remains is a set of principles that governed his approach. Use structure like a shield. Keep promises, even coercive ones, because predictability breeds compliance. Push just enough to avoid backlash. Cultivate information, then meter it out to those who can make trouble for you, never so much that you lose leverage. Those choices built his world and defined his risks. They delivered income, fostered loyalty, and bought time, right up until a statute designed to describe continuing criminal enterprises outlined his life more neatly than any he could outline himself. No one who watched him closely would call the story glamorous. It is closer to accounting than adventure. Margins shaved from weekly receipts, interest compounded until it strangles, shipments diverted with a phone call and a signature, discipline enforced so quietly that outsiders miss the moment it happens. That is why his case became valuable to teachers, agents, and prosecutors. It demonstrates how harm can hide in schedules, how people can learn to accept pressure because it arrives exactly when they expect it, and how an enterprise can thrive in the spaces between laws until someone learns to read the pattern. He believed that if he controlled tempo, he controlled outcomes. For decades, that belief held. Phones rang when he wanted them to ring. Drivers left when he signaled. Envelopes moved like trains on a timetable. Illness arrived. A war erupted. Law enforcement adapted, and the timetable finally favored someone else. The logic of his life did not break. It met a stronger logic, that organized crime can be described as a whole, proven with fragments, and dismantled over time by institutions willing to learn from their own mistakes. His name marks the place where those logics collided, leaving behind not a legend to imitate, but a case to study, a set of cautions to remember, and a map of choices that look simple from far away and impossibly complicated up close. By the time the last filings were stamped and interviews faded from the airwaves, the city had already folded his story into its muscle memory. A few people still remembered the way a doorway seemed to quiet when he stepped through, or the way a delivery truck idled a little longer near certain alleys. Most only knew the name from books and case studies. The file reduced a sprawling life to pages, yet those pages preserved the essentials with a clarity that chatter never could. The schedules, the pressure calibrated to feel inevitable, the habit of passing small truths to investigators while guarding the income streams that held his crew together. That balancing act, part caution, part opportunism, had defined his rise and shaped his end. What followed his death was a long sorting. Historians tried to pry fact from lore. Agents in training rooms weighed the value of insider access against the price paid when the insider kept offending. Journalists filled in gaps, noting how a teenage errand runner became a captain with reach while cultivating a bond with federal handlers that would trouble the Bureau for years. Legal scholars used his record to explain how racketeering statutes knit together crimes that, by themselves, can look like scattered sparks, but, in context, form a steady fire. People who had lived near his roots nodded at the description. That was the pattern they had sensed without ever seeing the whole map. Across Brooklyn and Staten Island, successors stepped into spaces he had once managed. Some imitated his preference for quiet, but others raised the volume and paid for it. A racket that depends on invisibility suffers when noise grows. Official lotteries altered the landscape for numbers betting. Legal sports wagering later reshaped the market even more. What once relied on face-to-face trust shifted to screens and regulated houses, where records are the point, not the danger. Crews that stayed in the past found themselves pressured by technology as much as by detectives. The camouflage he had relied on routine, analog habits, cash flows, designed to leave faint trails thinned as the decade turned. The Colombo family bore the war's scars. Leadership struggled to knit factions together after dozens of prosecutions landed. Victor Orena received a life sentence. Carmine Persico continued to exert influence from prison. Lieutenants rotated through roles that once seemed to last for years. Stability never fully returned. Wiretaps and long sentences had changed the calculus. Younger figures entered a system that now expected surveillance, and those who tried to revive old patterns learned that patience is hard to rebuild after years of crisis. In that sense, the conflict he helped steer didn't just end rivalries. It altered the family's future capacity to act as it once had. Policy work in Washington and in field offices took his case as a lesson. Confidential informant guidelines thickened. Approvals climbed higher. Reviews turned more frequent and skeptical. Over time, offices insisted on clearer boundaries. What a handler could share, what a source could be allowed to do, how ongoing crimes must be documented, and when to cut ties even if intelligence flow suffered. Inspectors and auditors visited programs that had once run on the strength of personal trust. The principle hardened. Information has value, but not at any price. He did not cause that shift alone, yet his file was one of the binders on the table when changes were drafted. The debate played out in public too. Commentators who believed in insider-driven cases argued that without people like him, the structure of an enterprise remains guesswork. Microphones can record words but not always meaning. Critics countered that reliance can shade into accommodation, and that, even if criminal charges against a handler fail, trust in institutions erodes when a violent source seems to live under a softer sky. The dismissal of state charges against his primary handler, after a key witness lost credibility, sharpened the point without resolving it. It reminded everyone that cases stand or fall on reliable testimony and records, not on moral hunches. For families touched by his career, the aftermath looked nothing like policy. A shop that had paid weekly found extra dollars in the drawer when envelopes stopped, only to discover that other problems, competition, rent, taxes, waited where fear used to stand. A borrower who had lived under compounding interest felt relief and then wondered how to rebuild credit in a legitimate way. People connected to rivals still measured time by the war's milestones, remembering who vanished from a corner or who never returned to a favorite cafe. The cost ledger did not sit only in courts. It lived in households that had shaped their days around pressure, routine, and the need to avoid notice. Writers kept circling the same questions because those questions reached beyond one man. How do you teach restraint inside an unlawful enterprise? Can an agency learn from mistakes without losing its nerve to cultivate sources who truly know the inner rooms? Where should lines be drawn when a source is both useful and harmful in the same week? His biography put concrete examples behind abstract dilemmas. It showed that a life can be built on order without being orderly, that a person can serve two masters only so long as both believe they are getting the best of the deal, and that time eventually favors whoever keeps better records. His son's path added a coda that made the family name a shibboleth for cooperation of a different kind. From prison, Gregory Jr. provided information in terrorism matters during the mid-1990s, relaying observations and reports about fellow inmates tied to high-profile plots. He later argued that his help should have brought a shorter sentence. Prosecutors disagreed, and the back-and-forth filled motions and appeals. To outside observers, the track was unmistakable. Information as currency across generations, traded inside institutions that needed it, even while they distrusted the hands offering it. That echo kept the name on courtroom dockets long after the father's funeral. Another contested segment of the narrative, the 1964 Mississippi episode, never quite settled. Accounts that placed him in the Blood South, pressuring a local extremist for the location of 3 murdered civil rights workers, stayed in circulation because they explained a desperate moment for the country. The Bureau did not officially confirm that story. Scholars questioned sources. Others insisted the core held. Whether exact or embellished, the tale illustrated the knot at the center of his legend. A criminal used by the state when the state was under extreme pressure, a line crossed for reasons that felt compelling at the time and uncomfortable afterward. It is a parable about expediency, not a tidy fact, and yet parables endure because they teach. If you strip the story back to sequence, the line is easy to draw. Born in Brooklyn in 1928, he came of age in neighborhoods where favors and silence mattered. By the 1950 seconds, he was a steady earner under the Profaci banner, handling numbers, sports bets, loans, and protection with a method that favored calendars over noise. In 1963, he entered into a paid relationship with the FBI, offering pieces of truth that fit the Bureau's needs while protecting his crew's engine. A year later, the Mississippi search tied his name accurately, or not, to a national storm. Through the 1970 seconds, he solidified rank, acting as a captain who delivered receipts up the chain and discipline down it. In the mid-1980 seconds, a transfusion left him, according to filings and contemporary reports, HIV positive, a private battle he folded into his days without inviting sympathy. The early 1990 seconds brought the Persico arena split. He stood with Persico and, according to prosecutors, planned operations that steered the war. Arrest came in 1992, a racketeering plea in 1993, and death in federal custody in 1994. Arranged that way, the story looks simple. Lived, it was anything but. He managed a home, asked for ordinary family moments inside an extraordinary context, and kept confidences that later became exhibits or disputed recollections. He mentored younger men who would one day explain his rules to juries and readers. He balanced relationships that could not be honestly balanced. He sought to control variables that no person controls for long. Health, loyalty, the pace of a city, the patience of the government. A career designed to keep risks low still ended under the weight of cases that described his choices as a coherent whole. Even the nickname newspapers gave him says more about atmosphere than about a single deed. The label grew because people felt a chill when his name came up, not because he stomped through streets craving attention. He preferred effect to theater, quiet rooms, short sentences, agreements honored on time. That posture spared him for years, and explains why some business owners described him later as a strange kind of insurance. It also sums up the harm. A system that buys calm with fear stunts every choice it touches, keeping ambitions small and possibilities narrow. The accounts of people who lived under that system make the point better than any indictment. Tales from associates who cooperated, especially Larry Mazza, supplied the internal view that prosecutors and professors find so valuable. Those accounts showed how to run a crew as if you were running a schedule. Match personalities to tasks, rotate cars and meeting spots, assume every conversation could be replayed in a courtroom, and build loyalty with predictable outcomes rather than speeches. For a long time, that approach worked. Then it didn't. Wiretaps became common, statutes matured, juries learned to read charts that told stories in lines and arrows, and the tolerance for calculated violence shrank as victims' families found steadier paths into court. A last consideration closes the loop. Many people looking back try to decide whether he manipulated the government or the government used him. The record shows both. He kept himself useful and protected pieces of his world. Agents gained access and, at times, spared him consequences that others faced. Once the partnership ended, each side carried marks from it. The Bureau with bruising headlines and training reforms, his circle with sentences that grew from the same paperwork that had once held payments for tips. The lesson runs both directions. Leverage is powerful until it runs out, and it runs out when the needs of the larger system become clearer than the needs of the individual. What remains, after all the summaries, is a human-sized reminder about the pull of routine. He believed that if he kept timetables steady, if he signaled plainly and avoided panic, he could steer through any storm. That belief took him farther than swagger would have. It also hid the damage he did behind a facade of order. The neighborhoods where he worked learned that a smooth week can be a fragile shield if the price of that smoothness is paid in fear, in silence, and in the shrinking of choices. The agencies that studied him learned that precision without oversight can turn into a trap. Walk past the cafes and storefronts that once framed his days, and you will not see plaques. You will see ordinary life continuing, which was always the point of the business he ran, and the inquiry that finally unmade it. People open up in the morning, close at night, hope to keep trouble away. In between, the legacy he left fits into two truths that rarely share space easily. One says that secret worlds are best understood by those who live inside them. The other says that trusting such guides is a risk that must be measured again and again. His biography sits where those truths meet. The harm he caused is not reduced by the clarity he offers. The clarity is why we still talk about him. There is, too, a civics lesson tucked into the sequence. Institutions can learn. Cases can lead to better rules. Communities can name harms that once felt inevitable. The city can assimilate a life as complex as his and keep moving with a steadier sense of what not to repeat. He is long gone. His influence on the streets is over. Yet the frameworks created to catch people like him and the caution taught to those who manage informants like him continue. In that persistence lies the most hopeful part of an otherwise stark narrative, that a record can become instruction, and instruction can prevent a future that looks too much like the past. If you listen to the faintest echo under all the arguments, you hear a simple theme: order matters, but so does the way it is made. He assembled order out of pressure, secrets, and leverage. The law sought to restore order through evidence, patience, and rules that tell the whole story, not just one act at a time. For decades, his approach outpaced the system meant to stop him. In the end, the system caught up. That closing image of a city that learned how to read the patterns he drew makes better bedtime company than any moniker or myth attached to his name. It is the part that lingers when the lights go out. Not a legend to admire, but a set of lessons to keep. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Thanking you for joining me on this quiet reflection of loyalty, mystery, and power. If this story helped you unwind or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch, but haven't subscribed yet. So if you enjoyed this story, your support truly helps us keep bringing these powerful tales to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.